Cool, great. So this will be the final part of videos for chapter one. And I sort of mentioned earlier on this idea of under absorption and over absorption. And this exists primarily, or this idea exists because during the year, standard costs are being inputted into the statement, into the management accounting process. So think of it like, I guess, in like an accruals situation, really, where all the figures are based on standard costs, and that's what your journaling is. That's the kind of journaling that's taking place. So you're debiting expenses as you're going along. But in the end of the month, you now actually find out what's actually happened. So of course you will, if you like, then whether put through another journal to increase the expenses if you have under absorbed, if you like, oops, sorry, so far, or you would credit the expenses, right, if you have over absorbed, if you like. So this is what I mean, this is all I'm saying here. A predetermined overhead absorption rate is, again, because we've discussed this, standard costs are done right at the beginning to enable unit costs to be calculated quickly throughout the year. And then we have this kind of, I mean, which is nothing, which is pretty much what we've done. We have a budgeted overhead and divided by a budgeted volume. And then we now have this kind of overhead absorption rate, which we have calculated, kind of put through, and we now have, if you like, our direct overhead. So we have direct materials, direct labor, we now have direct overhead. Calculate the thing, go on. At the end of the year, we now see actual. When this is what it should be, put a journal through. So if you have under absorbed throughout the year, where your direct overheads are less than what they actually are, under absorption, you now have to top up. If you have over absorbed because you had a pretty high OAR because you're using figures from last year and that was an extraordinary year where costs were actually abnormally higher, I don't know, whatever, due to inflation, or you think of anything, suppliers, whatever it is, the key point is that it was higher. So over-absorption occurs because absorbed was greater than actual, and under-absorption occurs because absorption was less than your actual. Right, so marginal costing. Now, marginal costing, I remember, I'll tell you a little story to maybe kind of make this real. Someone was talking about teaching in a class and said something along the lines of, if you have a teacher, if you have a school that assumes that they will have 10 students in the class and they will have one teacher. So initially they might budget based on this kind of one teacher and 10 students. Yes, but here's the thing, I'm going to change my pen color just to show you how marginal costing, this whole idea of marginal costing is so common and thought about. Imagine another student turns up. Imagine this classroom can actually take, I don't know, whatever, 15 students. And another student turns up. Now, here's the thing. When the student turns up and this student comes in saying, okay, I want to pay, and the fees, I don't know, for this course is maybe, I'm just going to assume it's $5,000. But we have to, if you like, buy books for the student. And remember, the teacher's already teaching this student, this class of 10 students. This student literally coming into the class, the teacher doesn't start teaching anything extraordinary, anything different. It's the same students that they're teaching to. So post this budget setting, what we're really arguing here is, if another student comes in and this student, we need to buy them books and we need to give them some, I don't know, whatever, we've already factored this 10 students technically has covered, if you like, the wages of this one teacher based on our initial analysis or our initial budget setting. So if this is only going to cost £1,000 in terms of all the paperwork that we must do for the student, the argument is that in terms of making judgments, we can now see that we can almost argue here that we have the marginal revenue, which is the additional revenue coming in from the student, and just sort of variable cost, which is per student, if you like, just the variable cost per student. So we can't really factor in the fixed costs of rent anymore because, per se, these have already been covered by the 10 students. So no one is denying that fixed costs don't matter. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that in terms of making certain decisions, we need to think differently sometimes and just think about what's really going on. Should we take on this additional student? And yes, we should. We have space for 15. The student's going to come in. It's only costing us 1,000. The student's giving us 5,000, so we'll take it. And we can have another student come in. There'll be 1,000, and then we'll have 5,000. Now, of course, when we get to 15 students, I have to stop thinking like this because I have to think of fixed costs again. So the argument is, for the short term, in the short term, I mean, this applies literally to so much, this idea of marginal costing. But marginal costing says if we're able to break down costs and see what the cost is of making an additional unit, which is this one student, which in effect is comparing it with the marginal revenue, we can then and generally we can then make decisions. Now, I also in class I talked about this idea of that just knowing generally what it costs to make, because generally the idea is to sell an extra unit, you typically have to keep dropping your price. So I don't know, whatever I'm going to say, to sell an extra unit, you sell the first at 10, just the psychology behind it. This isn't always the case, but as a price taker in a market where there are other competitors, you may sell the first at 10 to someone who's quite desperate for the product, and then someone else who's not so desperate will be watching, and then you'll say, okay, you know what, you can have it for 9, and you can have it for 8, and you can have it for 7, whatever. You keep going. But at the same time, costs, you might, yes, economies of scale will mean you're selling something and you're able to sell at 1, and then, but it's still maybe even less actually. So maybe 1 and then 0.5. But then people start getting greedy and people want overtime, and so it starts going up. So this could go up all the way to 5, and this keeps falling all the way to 5. So the argument is that economists argue that you have to then ask the question, well, let's compare marginal revenue with marginal cost. There comes a point when you should be asking the question or saying that, well, if the marginal revenue will not be greater than the marginal cost, we will not make any more, because you're in effect losing for every extra unit you make. So the principle of marginal costing is very much short-term decision making, if you like, for us accountants. But the concept in itself really is asking us to compare marginal revenue, marginal cost when it comes to shall we make the next item, if you like. And it's almost telling us that fixed costs aren't real costs. When I say real costs, they're not in the actual product itself. They are there. It's unfortunate. I mean, think of it like this: if we worked in a highly efficient society where solar energy was being used, if you like, and wind energy, where these were using natural resources that are sustainable, and we were just able to power our factories with this, we wouldn't have all the fixed costs we have technically, and then we just have to focus on the actual cost of making the thing, which is the marginal cost or the variable cost. That's never going to change technically. You still need raw materials to make something, so that's what variable cost is. And variable cost in effect is marginal cost, the cost of making the thing. Right, so marginal cost, as far as my slides are saying, marginal cost is the extra cost arising of making and selling one more unit of a product or a service. Or in effect, if you weren't making it, the saving, if you like, as a result of making or selling one less unit. Contribution, these are very much going back to the days of management accounting. Selling price minus variable cost is equal to your contribution. And what does that mean? If you're selling something for 10 and the variable cost or the marginal cost of making it is 3, then your contribution is £7. You're making £7. This is before fixed costs. So think of it like this: if your rent was 7,000, and it's all about decision making, you sell. It costs you £3 to just make the item. When I say variable cost, just the item, cost of sales, the raw materials. You sell it for 10, you get £7. You have a landlord standing outside, so you start making this sort of decisions. Well, I need to sell 1,000 units in order to pay my landlord before I can talk about profit. So we talk about this idea of break even. So marginal costing really forces us to, or causes us to think in terms of how do we meet our fixed costs with contribution towards our fixed costs. It clearly separates the fixed costs from the variable costs, and the accounting is built that way and designed, if you like, designed that way. Again, so contribution, if you like, it contributes, if you like, all our figures from contribution, or everything we're getting from contribution contributes towards clearing out our fixed costs. And again, of course, with marginal costing, what we're seeing here is this the fact that we're looking at sales, which is variable, if you like, more sales. When I say these change with output, they move in in step, if you like, with in direct proportion to the volume of units, sold. And profits will increase as sales volume rises, of course, that's fine. So once we have covered our fixed costs, anything post that, if you like, any extra contribution, when I say any extra contribution, in my case where I had 10 minus 3, 7, once I paid my fixed cost of 7,000, all of this £7 on every next unit becomes profit. Right? So it's just how do I want to analyze something? Right? And how do I want to think about it? And that's what marginal costing, that breakdown, marginal costing allows us to think like that. I talked earlier on about the school, the teacher. Just breaking things down allows you to make better decisions, really. Yeah, and I think this question, because it's all volume based, it allows us to think in terms of volume. Now, so the question here is not about one being better than the other. They're just different tools. Oh, I have 10 minutes again. I'll finish off very soon. Just different tools. Absorption costing, very much a sort of risk averse method of saying, listen, I just want to be sure I've covered all my costs. Maybe someone's asked you for a quote, which is why we would do what we did with those traditional overheads. We're right at the start of our business. We have a fixed budget. It's just sort of, it makes rational sense to think about it like that. But it can't help with future decision making, because you will have that production overhead in that cost analysis, and that doesn't let you see clearly where you can make decisions. It doesn't help you think, okay, where have I covered my fixed costs, and where can I now be a bit more relaxed because I'm trying to gain market share. So the arc ultimately is like, okay, I've covered my fixed costs. Where now the only cost I have to think about is variable cost or marginal cost, and that's where marginal costing comes into play as an efficient tool. And that's kind of the principle. The IAS2 only allows, of course, it has to only allow absorption costing, right? Because we must include all the costs involved. So you can see there's a place for absorption costing. There's very much a place for marginal costing, which is very much about decision making. Awesome. Great stuff. That's the end of that chapter. We'll move on to chapter 2, 3, and 4.